You're listening to a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
Hindu, Sikh, Buddha.
An Indian lawmaker reads aloud a list of religious groups given a pathway to citizenship under the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act, or CAA. That includes Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Christians, and Parsis who fled to Hindu-majority India from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan before December 31st, 2014. Muslims were not on the list, and that upset people across the country. Hundreds of thousands, in fact, took to the streets after the law passed in 2019. To enforce the law, New Delhi announced it would update the national registry, asking millions of people to prove their citizenship.
You're asking people whose name might somehow get off this National Register of Citizens if it's spelled with an I instead of two E's, if you're a woman and you get married to a family and your last name sort of isn't on the records, you have to now go back and prove that your parents, your grandparents, everybody has lived in India since back to 1950s.
It's been over 4 years since the amendment was passed, but the pandemic stalled plans to enforce it. With Indian general elections looming, the ruling Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, has re-upped their promise to crack down on illegal residents. But many believe it's gone far beyond that, in a campaign to remove Muslims from India, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. To learn more, we sat down with independent journalist Angad Singh.
If you are anybody besides a Muslim and you don't have your papers, the Citizenship Amendment Act is going to cover you. But if the National Registry of Citizens is sort of updated, now that essentially means that Muslims are kind of going to be the only people who don't have a way to get their citizenship back if somehow they find themselves declared an illegal immigrant or not having the right papers, tracing all the way back for more than half a century.
Protests have reignited, and a discrimination case has been taken up to the country's Supreme Court. What will come of it? I'm Brian Wood, here to talk about Asia. Okay, so why don't I just get straight into it? What exactly is the Citizenship Amendment Act?
So the Citizenship Amendment Act is kind of what it sounds like. It is a law that has just recently been notified or made into an active law in India. And what it does is it amends what it means to be a citizen in India. And essentially what this amendment does is it gives Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Christians, Jains, Parsis, anybody that's been in the country from 3 neighboring Muslim majority states out of India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, as long as they've been in India from before December 31st, 2014, they will have a fast track to becoming a citizen. Now, notably, this law is excluding Muslims from that category, and that is why there's been so much sort of headlines around this issue in the news globally.
You mentioned it's a fast track for citizenship for those who came to India before December 31st, 2014. Is there significance to that date?
I don't believe that there is any sort of significance. And I think that's also one of the complaints that a lot of people who are sort of protesting or challenging the constitutionality of this act are saying this date sort of seems kind of arbitrary. Like, what about people that come to India after it? I mean, essentially, the Citizenship Amendment Act is supposed to be something that makes India a safe haven for persecuted religious minorities. And that date is notably one notable issue with what people are saying is a bit of a problem about it.
When did the CAA come about, and why in that particular moment?
So the Citizenship Amendment Act is sort of new to the Modi administration, which came to power in 2014. The ruling party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which to most folks who aren't familiar with India is sort of commonly made synonymous with the Hindu Nationalist Party of India. They introduced this law as a bill back in 2016 during Modi's first term in office. And it sort of progressed from there. It didn't get passed in the first term, but it became a key election platform and promise in the manifesto of India's Hindu Nationalist Party. And they campaigned on the issue, and when they returned back to power back in 2019, it was one of the first pieces of Hindu nationalist legislation that they pursued and got passed in Parliament, which was back in December of 2019. But since that law was sort of passed by the Parliament, there were widespread protests that sort of came to an end, honestly because of COVID, but it had really divided the country for quite a while. And it's been sort of, passed, but not in effect up until recently, up until last week.
I'm curious as to what people were saying on both sides of the argument.
So first, I'd like to address the government's sort of positive narrative on the Citizenship Amendment Act. This is something that they're very keen on sort of making sure is heard. And that is that essentially what the Indian government is trying to do with this act is provide a pathway for these persecuted minorities. And anybody that sort of supports the government and this act, they will vehemently argue that, look, these majority Muslim countries where Islam is the state religion, there are minorities there that face really brutal and gruesome persecution, whether that's having their places of worship attacked in terrorist attacks being blown up, whether that's Islamist groups going after them, or oppressive blasphemy laws that essentially require the death sentence for somebody that might insult Islam. The state of minorities in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh has never been that good under these sort of Islamic extremist rules that sort of exist there, especially the extremist groups, rather, that sort of go after these minorities. So from the government side, this was essentially a pitch like, look, and I personally am a Sikh, which is one of the religions that is given sort of accommodation under this act. And, there's so many Sikhs in the last few years that have fled Afghanistan as the Taliban sort of came back to power. So on the government side, essentially they're pitching it as this law that it only would safeguard the rights of anyone. It's not taking anybody's rights away on the surface. That being said, why were so many Indians against it? Why are so many people protesting? Like, look, we don't think this is constitutional. We think this is fundamentally changing the secular core of India. And the reason that they feel that way is because you have to look at what is going on just outside of this law, which is during the campaign of the Modi administration back in 2019, the second most powerful minister in the country, the Home Minister Amit Shah, was very close to Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He was very clear. He said, you have to understand the chronology. The chronology is that first we will give these refugees citizenship in India based on the Citizenship Amendment Act. And following that, we are going to enact the National Registry of Citizens. We are going to update essentially our citizenship rolls. And then we're going to get all of the illegals out of this country, all of the infiltrators. This is the sort of charged language that the Hindu nationalist ruling party uses, and it's essentially a dog whistle for Muslims, right? And that is why people came out in the streets back in 2019.
What did the protests look like?
So protests really began back in 2019 in December. One of the most iconic ones was at Jamia Millia Islamia University in New Delhi. And students there have been protesting against this reform. And on December 15th, 2019, police sort of came onto campus, broke into the library, started beating students with batons and tear gassing them inside the building. And that just sort of made national headlines, international headlines. It was a really dark moment to see these students brutalized by police forces. And that prompted nationwide protests, kind of culminating in around late February of 2020. The Delhi riots, where more than 70 people were killed. So the sort of tensions around this protest became really, really high. And essentially what had happened is after that student protest in the university, a bunch of moms and a lot of Muslims from the Delhi area got onto a highway and basically blocked it off. And they just made a camp there. They said, we're not moving till you do away with this act because it discriminates against us, against Muslims. And then that started becoming this very charged protest, something that members of the ruling party in the Delhi area started, inciting mobs, essentially, like saying very hateful slogans, things like, to the traitors of the nation, we have to shoot them. I mean, literally, you have elected local politicians coming out and advocating to shoot these so-called traitors. And it culminated in these Delhi riots. So it was a very, very tense and charged situation that ultimately only resolved itself because of COVID and the sort of lockdowns that were imposed on the country.
India is huge, and so is its Muslim population. Is there a particular region most affected by the CAA, or are Muslims sort of interspersed throughout the country?
Essentially, you have to first sort of understand this from the geography of India. On the sort of western side, you've got Afghanistan and Pakistan and a lot of Hindus, Sikhs, and sort of other groups sort of coming across and seeking refuge in India. But that is kind of the vast majority. Really, the sort of scope of this problem and where this has become such an animating issue is on the other border, on Bangladesh, which is one of the longest borders in the world. And it's sort of shifting border that goes through these like riverous lowlands. And over the last 50 years or so, one Bangladeshi economist, he estimated that more than 11 million Hindus have migrated from Bangladesh into India. And there are definitely Muslims that are also coming along as well. Just to put that in perspective, that's about more than 600 people a day. And so the scale of the amount of people that are sort of coming into India from Bangladesh is really, really big. And a lot of the folks in that region, in the northeast of India, they've been sort of saying, look, there's a problem of, people that aren't from here that are sort of coming from Bangladesh and they're economic migrants. That's essentially the sort of argument they say. And they said they're not really welcome here. Now, there's sort of ethnic overtones to this language and, potentially a bit of racism even on that front because the subcontinent of India is so diverse. I mean, it's 1.4 billion people with, as many languages, if not more, than all of Europe. And the diversity is absolutely mind-boggling once you get to know India and South Asia more broadly. But, essentially what's going on here is on that side of the border, people are really concerned about this problem. And so this was the ruling party's sort of solution is, on one hand, we're going to bring in this Citizenship Amendment Act. We're going to give everybody but Muslims a pathway to citizenship as long as you've been here in India. But on the other hand, we're going to update the National Registry of Citizens. We're going to start making people prove their ancestry is Indian. And this National Registry of Citizens, if I recall correctly, hasn't been updated since something like the 1950s. Now, that essentially means that Muslims are kind of going to be the only people who don't have a way to get their citizenship back if somehow they find themselves, declared an illegal immigrant or, not having the right papers, tracing all the way back for more than half a century. And in a country where there's so much, illiteracy rates are really high still, especially back in history, it's very hard to sort of find your parents' and your grandparents' birth certificates and documents if they even have them. I mean, I don't have my grandmother or mother's, birth certificate handy to me, so I can imagine how difficult it would be for so many Indians that have the potential to sort of be affected by this. So, yeah, ultimately, this is a system that people are seeing through. The government is sort of saying this is only a policy that can grant people citizenship. It won't take it away. But on the other hand, they clearly have this plan to take away people's citizenship.
So all of that was over 4 years ago. What's happened since then? Why is it coming up again now?
I think the reason this law is sort of being notified at this moment is we're on the precipice of the 2024 general election. And this was a huge campaign promise by the Modi administration back in 2019. And I think even though this was such a politically charged moment and law that they passed, having not notified it means it's not really active. And so I think if I had to guess, it was, a bit of the ruling party saying, look, we make good on the promises that we pledge, and we're going to get that done before we head into this next election. So I think ultimately that was the goal. And right now, the Modi administration has done several landmark Hindu nationalist goals in this last 5-year term. And the Citizenship Amendment Act is sort of their crowning achievement in a lot of ways.
Okay, so now that there's conversation about it being enforced again, how are people responding? Is it similar to 2019?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's not nearly the same degree as sort of street protests that are going on as 2019, but there's certainly been a flurry of legal challenges that are, I think, in the Supreme Court at this point, challenging the constitutionality of this law. And I haven't had a full chance to sort of dive into all of them, but from what I do understand, the basic argument is around Article 14 of the Constitution. And Article 14 guarantees equality for folks in India. And what people are saying is, look, this law clearly discriminates against Muslims. But beyond that, there's, like you had mentioned at the start of this sort of interview, the date question is something that seems very arbitrary. But there's another thing. If India is supposed to be a place where persecuted minorities in the neighborhood can take refuge, why is it that you haven't given persecuted Hindus from Sri Lanka who were victims of alleged war crimes, died by the tens of thousands in the 1980s and 90s during the Sri Lankan Civil War? Why is there no provision to help them? What about the Tibetans, the Buddhists who fled the persecution in China and are taking refuge in India? What about them? Why don't we open up a pathway for citizenship for them? Why isn't that included in this law? What about the Rohingya minority that are persecuted in Burma and have been subject to one of the worst mass migrations in all of human history, being displaced from their homes? What about them? People even say, okay, you include Christians. If the argument is, look, Sikhs, Hindus, there's no other country for them besides India, why are you including Christians in this thing and not, say, Jews, for example? India has a long history of welcoming the Jewish people and being one of the few countries in the world that has never really persecuted them. So there's a lot of different angles under which people are just scratching their head around way of framing who is allowed to be a citizen in India and not allowed to be a citizen. How can this be constitutional when Article 14 says everyone should be equal? And so I think that is where you're seeing a bulk of the sort of legal challenge now to this. And to be clear, what it means that the government has notified it is essentially they've created a process now under which these persecuted minorities are able to go get their citizenship. And so for a lot of the Sikhs and Hindus and Parsis and Jains, I think the government did a study and it's about 31,000 people they estimate that will be eligible for citizenship under this. That is a huge step forward for them. But the risk of doing it under such a framework, the people that are sort of challenging this say is, look, this could potentially change the very soul, the secular soul of India.
You've talked a bit about how the CAA is important for the Hindu nationalist BJP with elections coming up soon. So how does all of this rhetoric play up against the current political climate?
That's a really good question. India hasn't announced the dates of its elections, but they happen over the course of a month or so usually, and that probably will happen sometime in April or May of this year. And, last time, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he won 55% of parliament, which was an unprecedented landslide, with just 37% of the popular vote. This year, his Hindu Nationalist Party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, is facing up against an alliance that has called itself the INDIA, or the Indian National Democratic Inclusive Alliance. That alliance is a mix of, regional and national parties in opposition to the BJP. But Modi is so confident. I think just a few days ago, even maybe today, he was out on giving a rally, and he said, we're going to take 400 seats, which is more than 70% of parliament this election. The Hindu Nationalist Party is very, very confident. And to give you a bit of context why, under Modi's administration, India has become the world's 5th largest economy. He promises to make it India's 3rd largest economy by the end of his next term, if he is elected. India was the first country to land a probe on the south pole of the moon, where India had previously discovered water, which is huge for the future of space exploration. He's investing like crazy into infrastructure. And the GDP per capita has grown a lot the last few years under his administration. So people are, on one hand, sort of starting to see growth in their lives. And a lot of that has to do with, the sort of geopolitical, situation, companies sort of looking towards India as this alternative to China. But also, the fact that India is now the world's most populous country. And when you have a lot of people, your economy grows. And the other sort of factor, though, is the Hindu nationalist identity. You see, India is a country of 29 different states, hundreds of different unofficial languages, I think 22 official languages, people who identify as different ethnic groups. And it's really this wonderful experiment in bringing such a diverse group of people under one banner. But that has been very challenging for a long time. And the Hindu nationalist movement is, in some ways, one of the first ways under which the 80% majority, Hindu majority of the country can sort of unite under one banner, under one vision. Now, a lot of people say, look, India is never meant to be a Hindu nationalist state. It's supposed to be a secular democracy. And there's a lot of people who feel that that is what is at stake if this Hindu nationalist party keeps coming to power and keeps getting to chip away at India's secular core. That's what they believe their policies do. But there's a lot of folks that say, no, look, the Hindu nationalist movement, it sees itself as a movement and a people that have been colonized time and time again, whether that was by the British or before them, the invading Muslims under the Mughals and others. So they really feel that it's their time to have this sort of nationalist movement. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who better than somebody who is the son of a tea seller, a common guy, to rise the ranks and become this populist leader and make people feel proud that even someone like a son of a tea seller can come to lead now the world's 5th largest economy. It is this feeling of really bold, brash nationalism and pride in the Hindu identity. And Modi is not shy to embrace that either. He is, scuba diving to sunken Hindu temples off the coast of Gujarat and inaugurating, the Ram Mandir built over the ruins of the demolished Babri Masjid or mosque that was standing for 400 years. He has embraced that image. And he, calls India, the Vishwaguru, that means the sort of leader of the world, teacher of the world. And, he's very, very proud of his Hindu identity. And a lot of people in India are. So they see him as the guy to sort of champion that vision of India forward.
For Modi supporters, what is their hope for a 3rd consecutive win?
I think that Modi supporters feel this immense sense of pride in the way they see India rising. And the hope is that another Modi administration will continue to bring India forward as sort of this country that is able to assert itself on the global stage. And they feel Modi is the guy to do that. He's got this charisma, the way he speaks. It's very powerful. It's very enticing. It's very enrapturing. And when he speaks to the crowd, it speaks to their heart. And so I think their biggest hope is that this guy who did make good on all of his big Hindu nationalist promises during this term, that if he says we're going to make India the 3rd biggest economy by the next term, they believe him because he's showing that he gets stuff done.
So bringing it full circle, what does this all mean for the Muslim population? What are some fears surrounding a 3rd Modi term?
Look, for Muslims, there are so many of them that definitely are very concerned about the future of India. You have senior members of Modi's party saying things like, if any country becomes more than 30% Muslim, they're in deep trouble. India is, in a way, the world's largest Muslim country as well. There's more than 200 million Muslims, I believe. There's just such a vast population of Muslims throughout the country. I believe they're about 18% of the population there. And it's the largest minority group in the country. So for them, this law is very scary because in and of itself, again, it doesn't impact or not impact a Muslim's ability to be a citizen in India or not. But it's this discussion around the National Registry of Citizens. And look, the only other time there was a BJP prime minister of the country, he amended the Citizenship Act as well. That was back in 2003. And he had set sort of the terms around what's sort of called an illegal immigrant and not. And he was the one that sort of instituted the policy of the National Register of Citizens. So you have a history of this party and these sort of right-wing Hindu nationalist politics sort of looking at the way you define citizenship as sort of fundamental view of their platform and their vision for India. And, one of the most common Hindu nationalist beliefs is actually all of the Muslims living in India, they're not actually Muslim. They feel that. What they say is, look, like, you're not Arab like those Muslims over there. You were Hindu. You were from here. So before you were converted, before the Muslims invaded, 1,000 years ago, you were actually Hindu. And some of the most fundamentalist and extremist Hindus in the Hindu nationalist movement at the grassroots level, they say those Muslims have no choice but to sort of merge back into the ocean of Hinduism once again. And that is the sort of reality that a lot of Muslims see themselves facing up against. I mean, you see these really horrific videos, even in like schools, where a Muslim kid will get called up to the front of the stage in some village in rural India, and the teacher calls the Hindu students up and instructs them to slap him for being Muslim. I mean, this is the extent to which their identity is persecuted in some places. So it is a very scary time for the Muslim community.
That's it for my questions, but is there anything else that you think the listeners should know?
Yeah, I mean, we covered a lot here today, and I just want to thank the listeners for your curiosity and tuning in to this episode and learning about something perhaps you hadn't heard about before. And I will also take the opportunity to plug myself. I'm Angad Singh. You can follow me on social media, ANGADGSINGH on all platforms. I'm an independent journalist at this point, so I'm just continuing to make content about global politics, news with the focus on South Asia, because that's where I and my people are from.
Once again, that was Angad Singh. I'm Brian Wood. Thanks for joining me.